One day in April in 1815, a 14,000-foot volcano that had been erupting for the previous few days finally blew its top. It was, and still is, the largest volcanic eruption ever recorded by humans. On today's episode of Life's Potluck Buffet, we're going to talk about some of the after effects of that eruption and its influence on the very first modern science fiction novel in English. And it wasn't about that eruption. I'm John Paulus. You're listening to Life's Potluck Buffet, only on YouTube. If you've been enjoying Life's Potluck Buffet, please subscribe. And if you've already subscribed, thank you so much. I truly appreciate it. And if you have a Brave browser, you can contribute basic attention tokens to Life's Potluck Buffet with John Paulus on YouTube. Thank you for your support, and thank you for listening. The mountain in question is a mountain in modern-day Indonesia called in English Mount Tambora or Tomboro. And the mountain is now 5,000 feet shorter than it was on April 9th, 1815. So large was that eruption on April 10th. There has never been in human history a larger volcanic eruption of a mountain like that. And the effects were both immediate and also were long-term. The immediate effects, of course, were great loss of life in the areas surrounding the mountain and far beyond, with tsunamis and so forth. And the explosion, when the mountain exploded, could be heard 1,200 miles away. Think about that, 1,200 miles away, the explosion was heard. So that tells you how big of an explosion it was. Again, the biggest in human recorded history. And that put up into the atmosphere so much aerosolized sulfur that it changed the climate for the next 3 years. And the climate of northern parts of the world were already in a temperature low, and so they were already colder than usual. And the additional cooling caused by all of the particles in the air from the explosion of the volcano that circled around the world in the atmosphere, that cooling resulted in temperatures the next summer, the summer of 1816. It resulted in temperatures that were about 1 degree Celsius lower than average, which for an average temperature is a lot and makes a big difference in terms of the weather. And in parts of Western Europe and northern North America, the year 1816, it became known as the year without a summer. In places around the world, in dry places, there was lots of rain. In wet places, there was total drought, like certain parts of Brazil, for example. There were floods in China. And there were effects that were felt globally. And in areas of Western Europe, already war-torn from the Napoleonic Wars and already suffering from lower than usual temperatures, the results were catastrophic, as they were in Canada and in New England in the United States. Just to give you a sense, things that were reported as happening in the summer of 1816 around the world were snow in Taiwan, frozen lakes in the northeast of the United States. The art of the time was changed, We can actually see in, for example, depictions of sunsets and scenes go from being very blue and so forth to becoming very red. And in fact, some painters' styles uh, that we chalk up to their actual styles were actually probably because of the sulfuric content of the atmosphere, causing very brilliant yellow and red and so forth in times at all times really, and not just at sunset. In fact, what the people at the time called it a dry fog that just never lifted, because it wasn't like fog. It wasn't water vapor. It was the particulate matter in the air. That dry fog was because of the eruption of Mount Tambora the year before. And while painting would temporarily be changed for the next few years, writing in the English language was forever changed because of the weather conditions of the summer of 1816. Outside of Geneva, 4 writers, 2 of whom would be married later in the year and already had a child together, were holed up in a house together because of the miserable, cold, rainy, and overcast summer caused by the eruptions of Mount Tambora. So they whiled the hours reading ghost stories translated from German into French. And one day, one of the writers, their host, Lord Byron, suggested that they all write their own ghost stories. And so they all set about doing that. One of the writers started with a story that, well, was deemed to be pretty bad. But the others still were working on them. And one of them didn't have any idea what she was going to write. And that was the author who would be known as Mary Shelley. And Mary Shelley, who at the time was Mary Godwin, and whose mother was a famous author named Mary Wollstonecraft. Well, Mary Godwin was having a hard time figuring out what to write about. One night, she tells us, Percy Shelley, with whom Mary was in a relationship and had a child together, Percy Shelley and Lord Byron were talking about the experiments that were done by Dr. Darwin. Now, before you say, well, wait a second, what year was this? 1816. Charles Darwin wasn't famous in 1816. He was just a kid. And to which we must say, the Dr. Darwin that Shelley and Byron were discussing was most likely Erasmus Darwin, who's the grandfather of Charles Darwin, who was a medical doctor, as was Charles Darwin's father. So they could have been talking about Charles Darwin's father, but it seems like the famous Dr. Darwin at that point was Charles Darwin's grandfather. And they talked about how Charles Darwin's grandfather did experiments where he brought vermicelli, the noodle, to life, and all sorts of silly things like that. And that was that. But when Mary went to bed, she had a waking vision of such a type of doctor who had brought to life a creature who she saw in the curtains of the room. And she knew she immediately had the most terrifying ghost story to tell to everyone. And when they gathered for breakfast the next morning, she let them all know that she had a story, and she had the beginnings of it. And she wrote the beginnings of it as a short story. And it was so good that Percy Shelley encouraged her to write it not just as a short story, but as a full-length novel. And she did. And in doing so, Mary Shelley wrote Frankenstein, arguably the first true science fiction novel in English. Well, Let's ask the cards what story they have to tell us today and see what they have to say. So yellow lemons, blue dumplings, magenta noodles, cards. Tell us something. It's card 40. Try to see yourself with others' eyes. Okay, so now think of your own story as a history based solely on others' grateful words about your work or your interactions with them. What good things are you saying to yourself? So consider specific things that people have said about you and the actions that you did that caused their gratitude, and say them out loud. So try that today for a writing exercise, and I'll see you tomorrow on Life's Potluck Buffet.